my second point then is to turn to that essay, The Lived Experience of the Black Man from Black Skin, White Masks, and bring out, just to explain the two or three, I guess two really, central interpretive ideas that Fanon deploys to understand uh, experience of racism, basically. And there are ideas drawn primarily from Jean-Paul Sartre in his book Being in Nothingness. They're book ideas you would also find in Merleau-Ponty or other existential phenomenologists. But Sartre is the real source. And the first is the idea of being with others that Sartre talks about. The second is the idea of the body schema. And so I'm just going to start by reading a couple of passages from Fanon, and just to bring out these ideas. So we'll start at the beginning of chapter 5, which in my translation anyway is on page 89. So we'll start right at the beginning. Well, not quite at the beginning. The very first sentence is dirty nigger, or simply look, a Negro. So we'll come back to that. But the thing right after that, that's what I wanted to get. So here's Fanon's description, basically the description of what it is to be a person. He says, I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things. My soul desires to be at the origin of the world. That's what we are. That's what a person is, right? We are. Aristotle says at the beginning of the Metaphysics, all human beings by nature strive for knowing, which means it's our very nature to um, uh, be oriented towards comprehending things in the same way that it's the nature of a plant to turn towards the sun. That's the verb Aristotle uses, orogantai. That striving that is a natural natural disposition, basically. And so that's what we're like. We want to understand things. We're enthusiastic about the world, and we get engaged with things. We want the world to make sense to us, and that's what we try to do. And that's Fanon. I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things. Of course, my soul desires to be at the origin of the world. Um, that's a very nice and in a certain way moving description of what people are like. Mostly it's the description of what it is to be a subject, right? To you as a subject encounter the world and like it is what it is, but you don't know what it is, and you got to figure it out. And to be a subject is to try to make real within yourself, what's already out there. You try to understand things, um, uh, and it's a nice thing. Anyway, I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things. My soul desires to be at the origin of the world, and here I am, an object among other objects. So obviously he's referring back to that first sentence, dirty nigger. Somebody says this thing, not exactly to him, says this thing at him, although no doubt he's meant to hear it. But it's really pointing to him as a kind of thing in the world and defining him in a quite a critical way. So he has been made an object among the other objects. The situation he's talking about is particularly bad, and he refers to it as being locked in a suffocating reification. Yeah, and we'll go on to talk about that suffocating reification. But the thing he's experiencing is a version of what what all of us experience all the time. Um, Maybe you're driving down the car, you're in a hurry to get somewhere, and someone is crossing the street, talking with their friend, and they're walking a little slowly, and you just think to yourself, "Get out of the way! I want to get through there." And you basically just experience that person as an obstacle. You're not sympathizing with the reality that person's living. You are experiencing them as a lump of flesh in the middle of the road that's inhibiting your ability to get around that corner quickly, so you could get where you wanted to go. You know, or whatever. But we treat other people as objects, and other people treat us as objects all the time, because we are things in the world, and uh, uh, we are also subjects. But people are not wrong to recognize that we're things in the world. What's sad is that sometimes we're treated as only that. Right? We're just treated as an object, just treated as how we as a thing in the world fit in terms of the other person's interests and objectives and so on. So Fanon experiences that in a particularly nasty way, but anybody can experience that. So he goes on, locked in this suffocating reification, I appealed to the other, so that his liberating gaze, gliding over my body, suddenly smoothed the rough edges, would give me back the lightness of being I thought I had lost, and taking me out of the world, put me back into the world. And so that is, quite a beautiful description of what another person is. Um, I came into the world desirous to be at the origin of things. I discovered I was an object for others. I turned to the other to have them give me back myself. That's basically the situation Sartre describes in Being and Nothingness. The human existential condition is that we are subjects in a world with other subjects, and that means we are subjects who are also objects for others. And how that fact that we are objects for others is going to be played out is determined by them. And it can be played out in a very nasty way, which is what Fanon is going to talk about. But it doesn't have to be. People can't, you can be taken out of the world by the fact that you're an object for another, but the other can put you back in. You can appeal to the other so that his liberating gaze would give you back the lightness of being you thought you had lost. That's what happens in love or friendship. Another person validates you. Another person recognizes you for the subject that you are and becomes the voice in the world that basically says, you are who you take yourself to be. I recognize that you are what you think you are. I recognize your aspirations, your desires, your values, your history, all those things. I recognize your subjectivity for what it is, and I value it. Um, Another person can offer you something you can't offer yourself. The other person can, in a way, what you can sort of put it like this: they can kind of heal a wound for you. The wound, but not an optional wound. The wound that is your existential condition, that you are an object in the world. You have an outside that you can't control. You're vulnerable to others. You've already been subjected to the objectifying gaze of others just by being a subject in the world, by being a body. But in your vulnerability to another, or in their handling of your vulnerability, another person can make it nice that you're vulnerable. Another person can produce with you a good reality out of the fact that you're a person engaging with another person. Anyway, so yeah, you start off as a subject, you find you're in the world with other people, but that can be a great thing. Unfortunately, it's not in the case that Fanon is talking about. But in any case, I want to just start out with this little passage at the beginning of chapter 5, because in a few sentences there, he captures, it seems to be quite powerfully, the basic sort of different existential thrusts of our being. Like, you are a subject oriented towards engagement with the world. You are also in a world with other subjects, and that means you are an object for them, which can be problematically reifying, but it's also it opens you up to the possibility of a profound kind of meaning that exists by the other person recognizing your subjectivity and so on. So that's the first one, being with others. We're going to come back to that too, though, because there's another important point to bring out about that. Second, the body schema. So this is at the bottom of page 90, next page, basically. Again, he's talking about a problem. So I'll begin with the sentences about the problem. This is about 8 lines up from the bottom of the page. In the white world, the man of color encounters difficulty in elaborating his body schema. The image of one's body is solely negating. It's an image in the third person. Again, I'll come back later to the negative point there, but first I wanted to bring out the concept of the body schema. That's an idea, again, basically derived from Sartre's analysis of the body and being and nothingness. Before I read what he says, let me actually read a different sentence from Sartre that I think is one of the greatest sentences in Being and Nothingness for capturing what the book is about and what human life is about. This is on page 74. 6 lines down. So this is Sartre's description of the normal way you experience things. So he says the consciousness of man in action is non-reflective consciousness. It is a consciousness of something. And the transcendent which discloses itself to this consciousness is of a particular nature. Namely, it is a structure of exigency in the world, and the world correlatively discloses in it complex relations of instrumentality. So normally the way you live, in other words, as that subject who was trying to get to the origin of the world, normally the way you live is that you're engaged with the world in some kind of meaningful project, meaningful pursuit, and you don't stand back as a cognizing subject looking at an object on a pedestal. You're wrapped up in doing things, and the way the world presents itself to you is essentially as a task. He says a structure of exigency. It presents itself as something that needs to be done. Maybe you're in the kitchen and the kettle boils. Maybe you have a whistling tea kettle, and you hear the whistle, and you got to get the kettle off the burner. That's the consciousness of man in action, as he says, right? The consciousness of you as a person who's behaving and living is that a need for you to do something is beckoning you from over around the stove, right? The sound, of course, there are sound waves and so on. That's there, but the form your experience takes is finding yourself called to do something. So the sound isn't just heard by you as a detached kind of sensory experience. The sound is heard as a kind of summons to action. Go get the kettle off the burner. That's the structure of exigency that presents itself to you. And to do that, maybe you need to put down the book you're reading. You need to pick up, let's say, if maybe you have a old style kettle that's all metal and it's very hot, so maybe you need to pick up a cloth or a oven mitt or a pot holder or something to pick the kettle up off the burner. And maybe you need to get a cup, your teacup, into which you're going to pour the hot water, something like that. So you were sitting there happily reading your book, and suddenly exigency called, right? The whistling tea kettle summoned you to action. And without ever thinking about it, right? As he says, the consciousness of man in action the consciousness of man in action is a pre-reflective consciousness. Without reflection, you put the book down, reach for the pot holder, get up out of your chair, walk across the room, grab the kettle, get the cup out of the cupboard and pour the water in. You live that experience as a call to carry out a task. And with that exigency, at the same time, the world correlatively disclosed in itself complex relations of instrumentality. In order to deal with that situation, you had to put the book on the table, pick up the pot holder, walk across the room, open the cupboard door, get the cup, etc. Again, those are not reflective things. You might even be carrying on a conversation with your friend, or maybe you're thinking about the passage you were just reading in that book, or who knows what you're doing. Could be all kinds of things, but you very intelligently carry out all those actions, but you do it without thinking about it. And in doing that, when you have to put the book down, suddenly the table is there as a ready surface for the book to go down on. Perhaps you actually need a bookmark because of the character of the book, and so suddenly the piece of paper is there on the table as a ready thing you can insert between the pages to mark where your reading ends. You weren't thinking about that piece of paper before. You weren't thinking about the tabletop before. But when the exigency of boiling kettle summoned you, the world at the same time disclosed itself in its instrumentality, right? The relevant value of things for facilitating your carrying out of your task came to salience in your perceptual life, but not at a reflective level. You know how to put a book down on the table. You know how to pick up a bookmark. Obviously, you had to notice them. Like there's something cognitive happening there, but not at the level of reflection, right? And it's also not just a habit. It's not just that whenever a kettle boils, you're in the habit of putting a book down or picking up a bookmark, right? You are uniquely responding to the fact that you were reading the book in this unusual situation in the kitchen where you don't usually read books, and you've maybe never used that bookmark before. But it's not just a habitual repetition of something. It's an intelligent, discriminating engagement with the worldly environment. But it's pre-reflective, and it's engagement with the world insofar as that world is instrumentally relevant for the carrying out of the task dictated by the boiling kettle, dictated by that worldly exigency. Same with walking across the floor. Your legs and feet are suddenly there to get you across the floor, whereas when you were sitting reading the book, you probably weren't really relating to them. The floor, similarly, suddenly relevant. The cupboard door and the hand that reaches out to it. The pot holder and the hand that reaches out to that, right? All of these things come to a kind of perceptual salience, but non-reflective. Behavioral salience, maybe I should say, as the kettle boils and that situation unfolds. That's what your experience of the world is usually like. So going back to Fanon's first remark, I was born into the world as a subject, blah, blah, blah. And this is what it's like to live as a subject. To live as a subject, you relate to the world as the world of your tasks, and there's kind of a interplay between you and the world, between the body and the world. You are responding to the terms the world sets for you, but it's also true that the way the world matters to you is defined by the kind of concerns you bring to it. So you are living out the demands of the situation of making coffee in the kitchen, a situation that you could never make sense of without talking about the realities of coffee and heat and electricity and all those things, sort of objective things. And you could also never make sense of them without talking about the realities of a person's concerns for daily life, right? The reality of that life in the kitchen is both sort of worldly and selfie at the same time. So that's what normal action is like. So now to get back to the body schema, he says here, this is at the bottom of 90, right after he's mentioned the body schema, he says, I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to stretch out my right arm and grab the pack of cigarettes lying at the other end of the table. That's like me saying, I know that if I'm going to get up to get the kettle, I'm going to have to put the book down on the table. Or if I want to get the cup, I'm going to have to get it out of the cupboard. Right? And he says, as for the matches, they're in the left drawer, and I shall have to move back a little. Yeah, if I'm going to get my cup, I'm going to have to walk over there and open the cupboard and get the cup. And he says, and I make all these moves, not out of habit. I may have never made them before. I'm not habituated to those moves. I may have learned about my kitchen through habitual relationships and so on, but these activities are not habitual activities. They're unique activities in a unique situation. So I make all these moves not out of habit, but by implicit knowledge. Yeah, of course, it's totally a matter of knowledge. What a book is, what a bookmark is, that there is a bookmark there, that there is a table there, that my cup is in the cupboard, right? These things all reflect knowledge and learning. But it's an implicit knowledge. It's not a knowledge that ever passes through me reflectively. He says, a slow construction of myself as a body in a spatial and temporal world, such seems to be the schema. Yeah, schema is the way you live yourself as a body and the way in which you know your body. You know your body, though, as the means for acting, the means for carrying out your projects and your relationship with the world. Your means for acting in response to the exigencies that present themselves within the terms of the world that you live, right? So the body schema means I know where my hand is, and I know how to move it. I know what it does when I need to put the book down. So body schema doesn't mean your body image in the sense that of sort of how you think about what you look like. Your body schema is your lived knowledge of your body as a behavioral resource. Right? It's your sense of I as an embodied capability for interacting with the world. What Husserl calls the I can. And he says, this sense of myself, this knowledge of myself as a bodily agent, he says the schema is not imposed on me. It's rather a definitive structuring of myself in the world. Definitive because it creates a genuine dialectic between my body and the world. Well, that's what I was getting at when I was just talking about the kitchen as sort of selfie and worldy at the same time. The world I inhabit is a world sort of meaningfully defined for me in terms of my bodily possibilities for interacting with it. Equally, my body is defined for me in terms of the demands the world presents to me. And he uses the word dialectic. Well, there's a interaction between those two things that is mutually defining and mutually transformative. Maybe if instead of thinking of reading the book or getting his cigarettes, those are both specialized kinds of knowledge that some people might have, but they're so familiar you might think everybody has those. So let's pick something a little more unfamiliar. Imagine an expert piano player, a real piano player. A real piano player, confronted with the demands of a live musical performance, let's say that involves improvisation or something like that, just creative playing in any setting, will be listening and will be responding musically to the things that happen. So playing is not a matter of habit in that case. If you're playing in a band, you're making creative choices. You're doing new things all the time. But the piano player knows how to hit that note. The piano player doesn't have to think, okay, I want to see a good piano player. A beginner might, but a good piano player doesn't have to think, okay, I want a C sharp that's an octave above middle C. So it's going to be this black key over here, this many keys above here, and I'm going to use my little finger to push it down with about this much pressure. Like, you don't think of that stuff. Like, if any thought is going to happen at all, it's probably going to be the piano player sort of hearing the music and hearing the kind of sound he or she wants to make, and then just making that sound. The way that when you want to make a sound speaking, you just make it. You say, you think, oh, I want to say hello, and you say hello, and those sounds come out of your mouth. In fact, you don't even pre-sound those things to yourself. You're conceiving of that as something to say, and you're saying it, or the same reality. Same with the piano player. The piano player a good piano player probably recognizes the note he or she wants to play in the act of playing it. And there's none of this reflective figuring out which key, where, etc., etc. There you can see, it's not habit, but implicit knowledge. You can see this pre-reflective thing. Well, I guess it's not habit, it's knowledge, but emphasizing the knowledge, you don't have that knowledge. So, unless you're an expert piano player. The piano player has that through a long process of learning. There's definitely knowledge that lets this happen, but it's knowledge that is lived in the hands and lived in the body's relationship to the piano. The very meaning of the person's body has become defined and structured by the layout of the piano. Like, now you articulate your musical goals by the way the piano keys are laid out. It's kind of ridiculous, but that's what you learn to do. You learn how to translate your musical values into this material and geometrical laying out of black and white keys. Your body has learned how to do that, and so you now have this meaningful relationship to your body that has had the term set for it by the piano. But it's also not just any old way of being set for by the piano, because it's also defined by your musical aspirations and all the rest in the history of yours and your culture's musical projects. So the reality of playing a piano can't be separated from the material realities of the instrument, but also can't be separated from the realities of the human players and their human projects, right? Anyway, so there you see becoming that piano player has depended on this dialectic of body and world, right? And your body schema is your lived knowledge of how to deal with the exigencies of the musical situations by bodily interacting with the instrumental, that's a kind of a pun, the instrumental possibilities presented by the instrument, pre-reflectively. That's normally what it's like to be a subject. That very subject we saw, who came into the world anxious to uncover the meaning of the world, desirous to be at the origin of things. Uh, now, the now things go badly. Now, uh, first of all, at the beginning, somebody says to him, "Dirty nigger," or simply "Look a Negro." Or he says on the next page, on the train, I go to sit down. In a train, this is at page 92, 5 lines down. In the train, it was a question of being aware of my body, not just no longer in the third person, but in triple. In the train, instead of one seat, they left me two or three. Basically, he's saying, if you're piano playing or if you're getting your cigarettes, you're just talking with your friend, you reach over, you get the piano. If you get on a train, you sit down in the seat just like any other person. You carry on your activity, they carry on your activity. Turns out that didn't happen when he would sit down on the train. He'd get on the train to take a seat. People would move away from him. They didn't want to sit beside him. So instead of taking up one seat, he takes up three. There's an empty seat on either side of him. So he's describing that kind of experience, some other ones too, which we may get to. But he's saying, okay, there are certain situations where I was drawn to attend to myself as a body. Again, not just in those subjective terms that define the body schema we were just describing, that lived sense of how to be a subject, how to be an agent in the world, but the body now became a certain kind of object. Now, there's going to be a couple other details I want to add to that, but let me just use that for the moment, right? That same move that we got on the first page, we get here with the body schema too, where he is now objectified, reified in a troubling way, and he has to think of his body differently. It's just quickly that, basically he is now a black man, or he's the dirty nigger, or the Negro, right? Here, he says, first, so he says, this is on page 91, about a dozen lines down. He says, beneath the body schema, I had created a historical racial schema. Created, I think he means, there's a notion he's using. Right? He didn't make it. He might make more sense to say he found that the way he lives his body has a historical racial schema as well as the body schema. What he means by that is he discovered that he as a bodily subject, or he as a body, was not just the subject we'd formerly been describing, but he was also, under the gaze of the other, defined as a kind of object, and he was defined as a raced person, a black person, but it's a historical racial schema, because that means his body was identified with a race and with a history, a historical interpretation of that race. And then on the next page he says, the body schema collapsed, giving way to an epidermal racial schema. So there's the historical racial schema and the epidermal racial schema, right? Being identified as that guy of that race, his body became suddenly a carrier for a historical meaning to race, but also an epidermal meaning. He's black, right? And what it means is his body turned out to have this powerful functional significance in relationship to the other on the basis of the epidermis, the skin, the recognizable color and features of his immediately visible body. And so he became, from the eyes of the other, he became black. He became black, and he became a Negro, where we can use black to be the sort of epidermal designation and Negro to be the historical designation. I'm just sort of making that up in the moment, but I hope you can capture what I'm trying to get at here. So what we have then is, these things he's picking up basically from existential phenomenology. We have our existential condition of selves in relationship to others, and lots of good things can happen there, but there is this crucial point that we can and are reified, and he's going to focus on the problems of the particular kind of reification he's subjected to. He and others are subjected to. Second, we have this idea that structure of subjectivity is lived bodily, which is this pre-reflective dialectic of subject and object as a response, pre-reflective response to exigency through the instrumentalities of a situation and so on. At that level too, the same point. There is a problem that we're in a world with other people and there's a kind of objectification, and that means that the transformation of his sense of what he is as a person or as a subject that we focused on in the first sort of quotation is correlated with or connected with transformation in a sense of what he is as a body that we've come up with here. The next point I want to make actually still continues that, but I think it'd be better for me to kind of start fresh. So I'm going to make a next point and connect it with what more broadly was my third point, which was to go through the study of his experience.